Taibbi is in such a better position than I am to do that because he has worked hard and earned credibility with a right-leaning audience. So when he starts saying things like the Republicans have very little institutional power nationally, and I think you're right, evincing that a not just a strategic choice, but a worldview shift that's so radically different from mine, I start to get worried that this isn't just about us having different strategies or different interest areas that are driving our focus, but I think a view of the world that I strongly disagree with and that I think is kind of delusional.
I think that kind of hit the nail on the head, because what happens in a lot of, I think part of the reason independent media was created is because a lot of people felt, including me, and I think you as well, that mainstream media, corporate media, so on and so forth, institutional media, whatever you want to call it, had a lot of blind spots, didn't include a lot of voices. It didn't include the proper diversity in many different ways you could measure diversity. And so we created, independent platforms. There's Substack, people post on social, people have Rumble series, Rumble video series, so on and so forth, YouTube. And the problem, though, is what happens when you start recreating the same problem as the people you were criticizing, right? Like, if we were upset, I think a lot of people were upset at CNN, Fox, so on and so forth about the war in Iraq. So they said they weren't reporting a lot of things. We had to present a different voice. We had to dig into things. But, if Taibbi is now synonymous with what Laura Ingraham would like to read, right? If everything that he writes is something that Laura Ingraham or Sean Hannity would sign on to and endorse, then is he just like a more online version of what those Fox evening shows are doing, right? Like even like Tucker leaving Fox, I think kind of understood this issue. I mean, Tucker recently had a pastor from Bethlehem in the West Bank, a Palestinian, and he challenged his audience, I think, severely with that. I saw so many conservatives attacking Tucker for doing that, and I'm sure Tucker knows that.
If you wake up in the morning and decide that your Christian faith requires you to support a foreign government blowing up churches and killing Christians, I think you've lost the thread.
But I think Tucker actually is pretty good at understanding that, like, if he's interested in something and thinks it's important, he's going to do a show about it, or he's going to explore it. And he probably feels more liberated having left Fox that he can do that, right? No one's going to be watching him over his shoulder, preventing him from doing that. So, I think in some way it's weird that like a former Fox News host would maybe get this more than someone who's in independent media. I think Taibbi's pretty much always been in independent media, whether he was when he was living in Russia doing Exile, and when he was in Rolling Stone, now when he's independent. Yeah. I think you really need to worry. I think when you're out there doing your own thing, when you don't have a boss, you don't have an editor, you really have to worry about keeping yourself in check and not becoming the kind of person who strokes the egos of your readers, of your subscribers. I mean, look, I know what it's like when you write something that your reader base hates and you just get mountains of hate, and it doesn't feel good. So I'm speaking from firsthand experience. Like, I would much rather just take the pulse of my readers and be like, okay, everybody hates this senator. I'm going to write something trashing this senator. Or, Taibbi writing, two pieces about the NPR cringe liberal CEO, right? Like, everybody was trashing her. I didn't see anybody defending her left, right, or center, right? I'm sure it was a very easy piece to write. I'm sure that his audience loved it. I'm looking at the likes. The first one got 1,499 hearts, 821 comments, which for Substack is enormous. Like, it's not like Twitter where everyone's writing a 50-word response. Like, these are substantive comments. There's a huge discussion going on about this, where of course I'm sure everybody exactly agrees. But like, this engagement farming, the clickbait stuff, like, it's just so easy, right? You feel so good to do. Everyone's telling you you're awesome. Everyone agrees with you. You're making more money. You're getting more views. I think this is what's happened to so much of independent media. So many people who operate on Substack are being hit with this right now. So many people who have YouTube shows are being hit with this right now. And, the only way to counter it is just to be conscious, right? Is for someone like me to start a conversation with Taibbi, like, dude, like, don't become the thing you hate. You wrote a whole book called Hate Inc. Hate Inc. was about how MSNBC and Fox both kind of created their own like universes where they just tell you how the other side's awful and evil, right? Well, Matt, are you a component of Hate Inc. now because you think the Democrats are a cult and you just hate them, and you think they hate you, which probably, considering the rough hearing he had on Capitol Hill, I understand why he would feel that way. Do you not want Democrats to read you at all? Are you not at all interested in what Republican governors of the House or the Supreme Court or maybe the president in less than a year, right, are doing?
Right.
Like, you have to consciously avoid that. And I think in the past, Taibbi,
and it's hard. I want to say that. I want to recognize that it's hard and that we all struggle with it. But like, I gotta say, I put out a Congo episode that I know that nobody wants to watch because I think it's important that I do a Congo episode. I put out a Haiti episode that I know nobody wants to watch. It gets 5,000 views on YouTube because I think it's important to me. And then we get back, you give the audience a little bit what they want, but the whole point of having an audience that's committed to you somewhat is that you can do your passion projects mixed in between, or things that you think are morally significant mixed up in between. But to completely abandon the stuff that brought you in this space to begin with, that defined so much of your early reporting.
I know how this is going to sound like I'm jealous or something, but like, if you're pulling in Taibbi kind of money, you can afford to lose a little bit every now and then. Like, not every post has to generate like 500 new paid subscribers or something, right? Like, Taibbi is one of the most successful people on that platform. And when you're one of the most successful people, I think you should be able to take more leaps of faith. You should be able to stick your neck out more than if you were someone who was just starting out, no one's heard of, and you really feel like you have to build an audience in a certain direction.
I think that's right. I want to come back to something you were just saying, though, about the Twitter files. This is another exchange that you two had. You said, I never said I object to your Twitter file stories. I object to you saying you won't write about Republicans anymore. We both know you don't want to upset your subscribers. Why lie about it? I always admired you for your honesty and integrity. Taibbi responded, after the Twitter files, Democratic politicians threatened me with jail, called me a Putin sympathizer and a Trump ally for doing my job. And now you're reprising Debbie Wasserman Schultz's act of calling me a sellout. Maybe I just genuinely think you all suck. So there we see some of this evidence that he does seem to be having a kind of reactive politics where it's about who's been beating up on him recently. And I get it. Like, I think all those people are shitty too. Democrats come after me and attack me and threaten me more than Republicans, for whom I'm largely invisible. But that hasn't changed who I think is the most powerful and I don't even say most powerful or most dangerous, but who is at least equally powerful and equally dangerous party in America.
Right, because like those facts should exist, independent and objective to like what our position is, right? Like if tomorrow, like, 1 million Democrats did a protest march outside my house saying down with Zaid, I would feel bad. I understand why I would feel bad, but it wouldn't change the reality that like my governor is a Republican, the whole legislature stacked with Republicans, and that they have much more power than Democrats do in my state, right? So yeah, and look, the Plaskett thing, one, she doesn't actually have the power to do that, so I don't even know why she's like a very like strange, I think she represents the Virgin Islands, so she doesn't even like
right. She's not even really,
power.
Yeah.
And yeah, like it was obviously an inappropriate thing she said, but no, nobody actually tried to put Matt Taibbi in jail. Okay, like they can't put him in jail for reporting the Twitter files or anything. So I don't know. I don't want to tell him maybe don't take it so personally, but like especially if you're an irreverent independent journalist, like you gotta have a little bit of a thick skin doing this work as well, right? Like
yeah, they fully hogtied Glenn Greenwald in his house in Brazil. I mean, people have really gone through things, and I don't want to make it. I don't want to say like unless you were hogtied in your house, you don't have a right to complain. But come on, have some perspective.
I mean, Glenn is a great example because Glenn did a bunch of stories that more or less exonerated Lula in Brazil, the center-left leader. And Bolsonaro and the right wing hated him, right? But then Glenn has been saying, hey, you can't censor Bolsonaro on the right. It's not good. He's been warring with this judge in Brazil who's trying to enact a lot of social media censorship against the right. That's because Glenn stuck to his principle, even though the fact that Brazilian right was literally like, I think someone tried to punch him on TV, like a right winger tried to punch him. Like they, his life was under risk. They threatened him with prison. All this stuff happened, and yet Glenn is still sticking to his principle that like he thinks censorship is wrong, and so he's standing up for the right now, even though they all hate him, right? Because he's a gay guy who was married to a progressive politician who helped free like Lula and so on and so forth. So like I think that, if you're doing this work, you got to avoid not only audience capture, but the second thing you're mentioning, which is like resentment based or like reactionary based postures, right? Like and also, by the way, when he said, I think he lumped me in with Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Stacey Plaskett. I don't represent the Democratic Party. They don't ask me about what they say to him. Okay, so like, he's got to leave me out of that. I have had plenty of quarrels with Democrats in my life, and plenty
I
with
know.
Republicans, right?
This is the point I was trying to make on Rising too. I was like, the reason that I was paying attention to your critique in particular, because you're not that guy. You're not that lib scold. You're not that easily caricatured critic, Democratic critic, Stacey Plaskett-esque critic of Matt Taibbi, who's just mad that he says things that are inconvenient to Democrats. You, in fact, are the Matt Taibbi type who largely gets in trouble for those exact same kind of things. So when you're making this kind of critique, I sit up and pay attention because, like Taibbi, I think you've earned your stripes as someone who's willing to have hard takes and who is not overly concerned or concerned, frankly, at all with what any cohort, whether it's a leftist cohort, a liberal cohort, or a right cohort, thinks of you.
I want to add one thing, that after I confronted Taibbi and after you confronted him on Rising, I did see that he did a couple pieces. One about Wall Street's war on workers. It was a book that he reviewed or he talked about. I'm sorry, he interviewed the author. And then he interviewed Chris Hedges on a similar topic. So I'm wondering if the critique kind of got to Taibbi, if he thought, yeah, maybe I am going.
And I saw a couple Palestine tweets too. They weren't like lengthy, but they're like kind of quote tweets and like, yeah, this is bad, sort of. I don't mean to diminish that. I'm just trying to characterize it.
I think that's part of why what we were doing was important, right? It's not like we're trying to tear down Matt Taibbi. It's
not at all.
We're saying that Taibbi is like a really like
valuable
weapon. A really powerful weapon that's only been pointed in one direction. And I'm like, no, there's just plenty of targets, right? There's plenty of other things you could do. And I think maybe he did internalize some of the critique with a couple of the articles he wrote mostly. I think mostly he's still on the same beats, but there was a little bit more diversity than normal on his website. I noticed that. And I'm not saying we should claim credit for it, but maybe he did take some of the critique to heart. I don't know.
Yeah, this was, by the way, just to stick with the Twitter files for a second, this was my critique when he came on Bad Faith last year to talk about the Twitter files. It was interesting because, and maybe we'll put some of these clips in so people can jog their memory. Tell me more about looking for it. I mean, what kind of searches have been done to try to investigate what was going on at Twitter around some of the Bernie bot, Bernie bro narratives in 2016 and 2020?
Let's just say that I've searched for anything involving the government and claims about Russia.
And Bernie.
No, not Bernie specifically, because I mean, I haven't done a search on Sanders. I haven't. I've done a search on Assange, but not much turns up. It's just not. It's not my priority to try to discern exactly what happened in the Nevada election, and I was looking for one thing, like, for instance, I didn't go looking for the Hamilton 68 story. That just happened to be because I was looking for Russia and some other stuff. And then I find this conversation about it. And it's a big deal internally at Twitter because it speaks to a larger issue about how these digital censorship organizations operate, like what their methodologies are. So there's a lot of talk about it back and forth inside the company, which was really, really interesting. Now, mostly, you're not going to see a whole lot of stuff where they say interesting things in these emails because mostly they're all in agreement about things. Like, again, most of the moderation is automated.
And has there been any searches about the nature of the algorithmic programming, since the overwhelming majority of the
we did a little bit of that at the beginning especially when Barry did the stuff on visibility filtering. We tried to make a whole glossary of how they do that, but again, once we got that story, once I found this other thing, I just focused on that. I left all that behind.
I had Glenn on first, and we were talking about the Twitter files, and I was raising some concerns that I had that were documentary in nature. So as someone who, as a lawyer, did a lot of document review, primarily document review as a junior attorney, I spent so much time thinking about what is the cache of documents? Have we actually been given everything that we've asked for? What search terms were used to cull the documents for us? And am I seeing holes in their search that are excluding documents that are responsive to the document request? Basically, how do I know I have everything that I've asked for, everything that is responsive to what my client needs and what they're entitled to get, right? And so I started asking him not just about what he knows about the universe of documents he was given and what might have been excluded, but also what kind of searches he applied to the cache once it had been offered to him, so that he knew that he was getting a representative slice of what was going on and not a slice that was reflecting his own search term bias, right? And I felt like his answers to those questions reflected a lack of thoughtfulness on both of those prongs, including that because I value the Twitter files and because I am so frustrated by shadow banning and because I'm frustrated by so much of the censorship that we sensed but couldn't prove against the left back in the 2016 and 2020 cycles, I was curious how much investigation he had done about those kinds of things. And I asked him, what kind of search terms to look at left censorship. Did you even just chuck the word Bernie in there for a quick search to see what kind of discussion there had been about Bernie bros and that kind of thing that we know from the Podesta emails were a focus of the Hillary campaign. And he literally hadn't done the search. And we'll put the clip here. I'm not representing, but that hadn't occurred to him. He seemed almost surprised. Like, oh yeah, it didn't even occur to him to do that kind of a search. So that doesn't mean you're a bad person, right? But like, that is the kind of thing people are concerned about when they make arguments like you are more focused, perhaps to the detriment of the truth of going after Democrats than looking at what other interest groups might have been negatively affected by people, including both Democrats and establishment Republicans.
Yeah, and I think, that speaks to partly that was a selection thing by Elon. I think Elon at some point realized, okay, he's alienated the left side of the spectrum. The right side of the spectrum needs to be, his friends. So he likely selected people to give them access to it, who I think would pursue that route. But there was someone who didn't do that. My friend Lee Fong did a Twitter file story related to how they were kind of assisting the Pentagon in some of their online kind of PSYOP things overseas. And he really stood out in that regard, I think, because he was probably the only.
I thought that was the best. Frankly, I don't mean this as a dig at Matt Taibbi, but as a compliment to Lee. I genuinely thought that was some of the most interesting of all of the Twitter file reporting. Absolutely. I mean, I have my own political bias as well.
And also Twitter is
an important substantive.
Twitter is a global platform, right?
Yeah.
Meaning they are probably getting all kinds of interesting political debates in India or in other parts of the world. And I think, at the end of the day, I don't think Elon went to a bunch of Indian journalists and was like, hey, I want you to look at this too, because I think this whole thing was probably about him trying to boost himself among the American right and say American conservatives are being censored, which I think in many cases they were. But just because of the weird, and to his credit, I think Taibbi was also weirded out by the arrangement, which is why eventually they had a falling out, right? But it just
right.
wasn't.
But the falling out wasn't about, like, here's the thing that frustrates me too, and we've been back and forth on this both on Rising and last year on my show. In fact, I'm going to unlock that episode so that everyone can hear the full conversation I had with Taibbi then. Because this all didn't come out of nowhere. I thought gentle and gracious and really trying to this wasn't about personal attacks, but I asked him about the nature of his break with Elon, because Bari Weiss, who I have no positive feelings for whatsoever, acted with, I think, the most integrity in that situation when very early on in the Twitter files, Elon flagrantly abridged his own commitment to free speech by banning the Elon Jets account, which was a Twitter account, which was simply aggregating the publicly available information about the travel patterns of his jet and tweeting about his whereabouts. Bari Weiss is like, what are you doing? You can't censor this account just because you don't like what they're doing with publicly available information. And he booted her off the Twitter files. Now, at that point, you can imagine a world where all of the other participants in the Twitter files say, if you want us to continue to do this journalism project, which boosts your profile as a free speech hero, a reputation which is now firmly enshrined, even though it's, I would argue, deeply unwarranted, then you have to bring Barry back onto the project. And you have to admit that you messed up in banning this account. That is not in line with the principles that you say you're espousing by giving us access to all of this information. They did not do that. Now, Matt would say, and he has said, it was more important for me to continue to get information out of the Twitter files and do reporting on that. And I think that's a legitimate disagreement. We can have difference of opinion about the extent to which you keep your mouth shut to get valuable information on which you want to do substantive reporting. I think reasonable minds can disagree about that point. But But we got to a point, by the way, but when I interviewed Glenn, and we should put the clip in of that too, I asked him if, given the power asymmetry of the Twitter files and the fact that you don't know what you're being given and that you could be a useful idiot for Elon Musk as he's trying to burnish his reputation as a free speech guy, would you agree to participate in it? He said he might not.
I probably would not have felt totally comfortable, to be honest, with the way in which it was done, in the sense that they were the guardians of the information, and the only information that you end up getting is information they decide to give you. And I'm not willing to kind of be manipulated by the possibility that people are handpicking what they want me to see or don't want me to see, because that can end up causing me or putting me in the position where I'm unwittingly serving as a spokesperson for an agenda that is not mine.
Glenn, isn't that kind of a big deal? Isn't that kind of a significant critique? And I think probably one of the only good faith critiques that's come down about everybody, including people whose journalism I respect so much, like Matt Taibbi, is that if you aren't able to have direct access to the primary documents, if you are, to your point, being served up some kind of sliver. I mean, I've seen Matt asked in like a call-in situation, what about censorship of the left? And he said, well, I just haven't seen very much of that. And maybe that's true. Maybe Twitter just had not that much interest in censoring the left. Fine. But when you are only getting a piece of the pie, it puts someone who is a good faith actor like Matt Taibbi in the position of making a representation, like Twitter wasn't that focused on censoring the left, that he might not be able to realistically speak to truthfully because he only has a piece of the picture.
Right. All he can say is, I didn't see it. And the reason he maybe didn't see it is because he wasn't shown it. So I guess, like, again, first of all, let me just say that there were no real left-wing journalists brought in, although like a framework that doesn't count Matt Taibbi and Li Feng as leftist is one that I don't fully trust. But like, it is true that people who are, say, like real leftists were not brought in. But notice as well that there were no real like MAGA journalists or far right journalists. They didn't invite Breitbart in or, Charlie Kirk in. I mean, I think Elon's vision of politics is a little bit simplistic. He thinks he's supposed to avoid the far left and the far right, and the people in the middle are the ones you trust. And to him, the middle is Barry Weiss, Matt Taibbi, Michael Schellenberger, these kind of people. And I think that was sort of what guided him. The critique that you're making, that you only get what the source shows you, and therefore the source may end up being able to manipulate your journalism, is completely correct. All I'm saying, once again, though, is that this is always how it is.
Glenn said he might not have taken this project on in the first place. I disagreed with him. I said, I think I'm with Taibbi. I would do it, but I would just be transparent around the vulnerabilities of the project. But Glenn even said that he might not even do it in the first place because it was so, there was so much potential for manipulation, basically. So, when I pushed Matt on, well, did you consider dropping out of the project at that point? He was like, well, I want to get more information. Then when he finally parted ways, it wasn't on one of these principled issues of Elon Musk isn't really doing free speech. It was Elon Musk in the petty Elon Musk fashion going after Matt Taibbi for having a Substack that he stupidly thought was competitive with Twitter. So it was about personal beef. It really wasn't even about any of these free speech principles.
Yeah, I also think that because this was all happening in public, also kind of created some weird pressures. Like, I think that Barry probably felt like she needed to speak out because she was getting a lot of pressure from people. Like, look at what Elon's doing. How can you participate in this? So she was feeling that personally. I think other people just found it to be very awkward. I know a lot of people were arguing with Elon privately, including Taibbi, who were involved in this project. And, I think some of the people, I think that Elon has definitely developed a base of people on there who will just like keep their mouth shut around him, right? Just because they know that he's the guy with the reins, right? Like, that's the bigger problematic part about all this, is that when Elon first took over Twitter, he said there's going to be like a whole council of people making these decisions about content moderation, right? Like, it'll include all these civil liberties groups, human rights groups, blah, blah, blah. And then that all just went out the window, and like, he personally makes those decisions now, right? Like, he hated Alex Jones, so he didn't bring him back. But then he like posted a survey, and people wanted him back. So he's like, okay, I'll bring him back. Like it's just like his whims, right? And that's just like such a terrible situation for Twitter to be in now. It's not the solution to what was happening before, which was a very like opaque and kind of hidden process that was very difficult to get like unbanned or even know why you were banned sometimes or suppressed. Yeah, I mean, no, I understand why he did it. I understand like why he dealt with Elon as a source to get the stories. But one, I think the point that you raised though, that he was seeking a very specific type of story when he could have sought anything. From what I understand from people who worked on this project, they could have looked for anything. Like as soon as they got access, they could have searched, for anything happening in the globe in any place. But it seems like mostly what came out of it was the online conservative to the interests of online conservatives, right? It didn't. And I think that's what Elon probably wanted.
And I even said to Taibbi, like, almost out of self-preservation, because so many Democrats were attacking you in bad faith because the gist of your reporting was making them look bad, you could have insulated yourself against some of that criticism. I think I had this conversation with him right before, I think, the hearing where Plaskett came after him. And I was like, you could insulate yourself against the flack you know you're going to get by doing some stories that do make Republicans, assuming it's true, right? Assuming that's what you find, that are more focused on Republican overreaches. I mean, the period of time during which, the Twitter files were covering, right? Like the Jack Dorsey era is largely the Trump era. So you can't tell me that there weren't an intelligence agency interest in tracking down people who are critical of Donald Trump and all of the kind of things we know. Donald Trump is someone who's very happy to manipulate the media to his own advantage. He's on trial right now for trying to do a buy and kill story with the Stormy Daniels stuff, right? So, why not just do that just to be able to point to something when the Democrats come after you to say you're even-handed and just calling balls and strikes? But that's not what happened. And just to your point, Zed, about this all happening in public, yes and no. Because what we now know, because of the disclosure of some of these private emails, and this is a point that seemed to really rankle him in our second interview on Rising about this, I was like, he accused me of getting some factual timeline errors wrong, which it's completely possible. I'm mea culpa. I'm human, and I'm happy to correct any of those when they're pointed out to me. But the core point here was that I was reading from his own disclosed DMs with Elon, where he said on April 10th of last year, 2023, Elon, I've repeatedly declined to criticize you and have nothing to do with your beef with Substack. Is there a reason why I'm being put in the middle of things? And I asked him, you've admitted, this isn't like my conjecture, that you had criticisms of Elon Musk that you declined to raise because you wanted to maintain a relationship and get more sourcing. Again, reasonable minds can disagree about how long that should go and how far that should go. But why are you treating it as like a personal attack? That is what people are upset with you about. Like, reasonable minds can disagree about whether or not you should have done it, but it's not a personal attack or a ad hominem attack against you to suggest what you've already just admitted about yourself. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.